Welcome to the New Hampshire Department of Justice, and thank you very much for joining us this morning. Let me start before I begin my remarks by just introducing the panel of speakers that are joining me this morning. To my far right is Marty Bolden. He's the Director of the City of Manchester Office of Youth Services. To my immediate right, over my right shoulder, is the Assistant United States Attorney Mark Zuckerman. We're very pleased to have our federal partners here today. Mark is one of the prosecutors that has brought one of the most significant human trafficking cases to verdict in the state of New Hampshire. To my far left is Grafton County Attorney Lara Sappho, who's come down from the North Country to join us. And to my immediate left is Erin Albright. She's the anti-trafficking coordinator for the International Institute of New England. January is the month in which President Obama has declared National Anti-Slavery and Human Trafficking Month. This declaration by the President coincides with the 150th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation, our historic document that signals our collective commitment to end slavery and all that it symbolizes. 150 years ago, that proclamation freed 100,000 slaves, and it was the first step in our country to abolishing slavery in the United States. And as we celebrate this historic anniversary, the truth is that slavery continues to exist in this country and in the state of New Hampshire. It continues to exist in the form of sex trafficking and coerced labor. We think of the trafficking of humans, and we tend to think globally. And when we do think about it globally, the trafficking of persons is a $32 billion industry. It is the fastest growing and second largest criminal activity in the world, only second to drug dealing and tied with arms trafficking. In a recent United States Department report has signaled that 12.3 million people live as victims of human trafficking in this world. Now, given the quality of life that we enjoy in New Hampshire, given the environment in which we live with the new snow that blankets our landscape, it's natural to think human trafficking doesn't occur widespread in the United States, and certainly not in New Hampshire. But to show the reality of the situation, I would invite you all to pick up your smartphones or your tablets and to search the websites of Backpage.com and other social media sites. And what you will find every day are advertisements. Advertisements for services in New Hampshire. Advertisements of very young women brought into this state or located in this state. And typically, they are photographed sitting on hotel beds. Hotel beds in this state, in Portsmouth, and Salem, in Nashua, in Manchester. In the advertisements offer their services, often you can see the generic artwork from the hotel walls situated behind them. And they are being victimized by human traffickers in New Hampshire. And you will also find New Hampshire citizens that pay traffickers every weekend to exploit these women further for personal gratification. This is occurring in New Hampshire, and we gather today as a multidisciplinary group to raise awareness about the growing problem and to talk to you in more detail about the steps we are taking as a community to address it. We've given this criminal activity a fancy term. We call it human trafficking. Personally, I think that's unfortunate, and I ask you not to be distracted by it. From my perspective, the label is more of a euphemism than a crime, because what is occurring is slavery, and it is occurring in the state of New Hampshire. It exists for teenage girls that are recruited by pimps and sold over the internet for sex. It exists for migrant workers on farms, and it exists for men, women, and children who work in restaurants, salons, and even construction that are being coerced for their labor. To give you a little bit more of the national perspective, the United States Department of Justice estimates that 200,000 American children are potentially trafficked each year into the sex trade. In a recent United States Department of State report entitled Trafficking in Persons Report 2010, the United States found that the majority of domestic victims enslaved into the sex industry are runaway and throwaway homeless youths. Nationally, 450,000 children run away from their homes each year. 1 of every 3 teens on the street will be lured towards prostitution within 48 hours of leaving home. This means that at least 150,000 children are lured into prostitution each year. And this victimization of children through human trafficking is a brutal form of child sexual abuse. Yet it is often overlooked and unrecognized. Child prostitutes have the unique status of being both victims and, under our law, offenders. Children who are at risk for commercial exploitation often have a history of truancy in running away that was precipitated by sexual and other abuse in their own homes. Studies show that nearly a third of these children who run away trade sex for food, drugs, money, or simply a place to stay. They are sought out by their exploiters, their traffickers, their pimps, and are lured into prostitution through a complex array of psychological and emotional controls between the ages of 11 and 16. The average age of children for entry into prostitution in the United States is 12 years. We have examples in New Hampshire. In October of 2011, a 16-year-old girl was recruited at an Occupy New Hampshire rally. The perpetrator was a woman, took the girl home to her house, took photos of her that were soon posted on advertisements on Backpage.com. According to the victim, the woman was going to train her to be a prostitute. And fortunately for this victim, the first client that was brought to service her happened to be an undercover agent. Most of our children are not so lucky. In May of 2011, a detective in Portsmouth received a call about a 16-year-old runaway from Nashua, advertised on Backpage.com. The traffickers, the perpetrators identified, were 2 men in their early 20s, and they were driving that teen to hotels throughout New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and Maine. And while most of our 16-year-old girls are worried about their driver's licenses and their SATs, this girl was being brought around New England and sold for sex. Just this past October, a home in Manchester was searched as part of an investigation into massage parlors and sex trafficking. We all want to believe this doesn't happen in New Hampshire, but it does. And we want to share with you today some of the steps we are taking as a state to address the growing problem of human trafficking. In 2007, a statewide interagency commission in human trafficking was legislatively created, to study the issue of human trafficking. It was chaired by Representative Suzanne Harvey. We've been most pleased to have her support and the entire support of the House delegation. I'm very pleased that our Majority Leader, Representative Steve Shirtless, has joined us today. Thank you very much, Representative. I also want to acknowledge Jennifer Durant. She's a public policy specialist for the New Hampshire Coalition, who played a lead role in the first steps to address human trafficking in the state of New Hampshire. She was the prime author of a report released in 2008 entitled The Hidden Problem of Human Trafficking, Addressing Modern-Day Slavery in New Hampshire. These steps, under their leadership in 2009, led to the passage of a law to criminalize human trafficking in New Hampshire in all its forms, sex trafficking and labor trafficking. And that resulted in extensive training for our advocates, our law enforcement officers, and our prosecutors to help identify this crime, to better understand the needs of the victims of this crime. But as we gathered last May at our annual conference on domestic violence and sexual assault, as a multidisciplinary group, we recognize that there is still much more that needs to be done in the state of New Hampshire to reaffirm our commitment to freedom in this country and to combat human trafficking in New Hampshire. And it is for this reason that today I am announcing the formation of our Commission to Combat Human Trafficking. It is comprised of experts from our state, local, and federal partners, law enforcement, victim advocates, community services, the criminal justice system, medical providers, and others. And it is the task of this special committee to craft a victim-centered, collaborative, multidisciplinary, statewide comprehensive approach to combating human trafficking in the state of New Hampshire. I have asked the Commission to look at 3 specific areas. First, in terms of legislation, we are going to review our state legislation and suggest potential amendments to the general court. I think we need to recognize that in 2009, we were on the forefront in the country of addressing legislation to combat human trafficking. Since that time, a lot of other states have learned this is a growing problem, and we have additional models that have gone into law, and I think it's incumbent on us to review those models, ensure that we have all appropriate legislative tools in place that we need. I've asked the Commission to focus on enforcement to ensure that all law enforcement and other first responders understand the complexities of these crimes, how to recognize victims, and how to effectively handle human trafficking cases. And we will thirdly focus on community partnerships and training, because it is nurses and doctors and EMTs and victim witness advocates that will be the first ones to identify the signs of victimization and human trafficking in this state. And finally, we will be creating a we'll be creating a victim-centered, multidisciplinary, comprehensive statewide protocol to standardize our responses to these horrific crimes and ensure that victims are provided with the comprehensive support and services that they need. It is time for us to have a statewide protocol on human trafficking. And our goal is that as we gather to celebrate the 2014 annual Slavery and Human Trafficking Awareness Month, that we will have launched a protocol and made significant progress in addressing human trafficking in New Hampshire. With that, it's my pleasure to introduce you to our chairs of our subcommittees and our key partners in this fight. And I first want to introduce Assistant United States Mark Zuckerman, President Obama, the United States Attorney General Holder, and United States Attorney for the District of New Hampshire, John Kakavas, have been leaders in the federal effort to combat human trafficking. We have a prosecutor in this state that prosecuted one of the most comprehensive first human trafficking cases, and I'm most pleased that Assistant United States Attorney Zuckerman is with us today. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you. First, I'd like to thank the Attorney General's office for its leadership in this area. As you just heard, in words more eloquent than frankly I could articulate myself, ever since the passage of, well, ever since the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation and then the passage of the 13th Amendment, there's been nothing more uniquely American than the fight against slavery to ensure freedom and justice for everybody within the protection of the laws of the United States. Congress brought that fight forward with the 20th century and now 21st century model in October of 2000 when the Trafficking Victims Protection Act was passed, which modernized our statutes to allow us to address the manner in which human traffickers had changed their tactics. They've moved on from the days of slavery that we fought against in the Civil War and that the Emancipation Proclamation was issued in reaction to, and that the 13th Amendment was issued in reaction to, ratified in reaction to, and found more subtle ways of oppressing individuals and exploiting them. And the Trafficking Victims Protection Act that Congress passed in 2000 added a new array of criminal tools to use to prosecute those human traffickers, including the sex trafficking crime, human trafficking crime, and others as well. But we also realized that the only way to truly address human traffickers is to do it universally and not just from the federal level. And there's probably no greater indication of that than the way most human trafficking cases come to light. Frankly, they don't get uncovered by intensive investigative efforts by police and federal agents. Most of the time it's an anonymous call, a neighbor, a social worker, a nurse in an emergency room, a teacher who picks up the phone and calls a local police department, maybe a federal agency, and says, I've seen something here that just doesn't look right. Something doesn't feel right. Something doesn't sound right. And it's that anonymous tip that ultimately has led to most of the human trafficking cases that have been successfully uncovered and prosecuted. Because as the Attorney General told you, this is a hidden crime. It is all around us all the time, but we never see it. And the traffickers know that. They know that the most effective way to conceal your actions is to hide them in plain sight. So when you're going down the street in Manchester or Portsmouth or Nashua, and you see a young girl on the street corner, and a little alarm bell goes off in your head, and you think, how tragic, and you move on. Stop. Think about what's happening. Maybe go pick up the phone, call the Manchester police, call the FBI, call Immigration and Customs Enforcement, call the Attorney General's office, because it's those anonymous tips that give us the opportunity to get in and investigate. As the Attorney General told you, this is a hugely profit-driven crime. That's the reason it happens. It happens as a result of greed. Traffickers are making money off the backs of the victims, by either having them lie on their backs in the illicit sex trade or bend their backs in forced labor. So it's a profit-driven crime that's good and bad. It's good from a law enforcement perspective because it does allow us to get the traffickers where they live under the Human Trafficking Protection Act and under the state statute, the state anti-trafficking statute. Not only can we obtain significant prison sentences for human traffickers, but there are also forfeiture provisions that allow us to get them, quite frankly, where they live, to recoup the money that they've illicitly gotten from exploiting the victims, and those funds can be used in part to help reimburse the victims, to help get them back to some sense of personal integration and to heal and to move on in their lives. Again, this effort couldn't take place without a collective and collaborative approach, and that's why the work that's being done here is so critically important. We have to do this from the ground up and as partners, and nothing better typifies that than the commission that the Attorney General has put in place and has pulled all of us together to put these protocols in place so that at 3 in the morning, when a beat officer has a young girl in the station house and doesn't know what to do, we will provide them with the tools and the resources to get that person safe and to go after the traffickers who victimized her and put her in that position. I want to thank you all very much for your attention to this, and please get the word out, because again, it's not only law enforcement, it's everybody on the street who sees what's going on that can help us curtail this problem and hopefully end it in our lifetimes. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. One of our most experienced attorneys in the state prosecuting court cases involving sexual violence and child abuse is our Grafton County Attorney, Lara Sappho, and I'm very pleased that she is serving as the chair of our Committee on Enforcement and Investigation. She's going to talk to you a little bit about what we're trying to do in the field to try to enhance the number of prosecutions that we can have against traffickers in this state, and really to change that mindset for investigators in the field in this area, to have them thinking, you know, maybe my target isn't a criminal, maybe my target is a victim. And so I'm very pleased to introduce you to Grafton County Attorney Lara Sappho.
And thank you very much for everyone being here today. It shows that you have an interest in this. And like everybody is saying here, this is something that we're all in together. This isn't something that one agency is going to be able to tackle. It's something that we can tackle only with everybody working together, all the governmental agencies, but also the public. So thank you so much for being here today. New Hampshire can be very proud that we enacted a human trafficking statute, and one of the first in the country. However, the reality is, although we know human trafficking is occurring in New Hampshire, we simply are not seeing enough people prosecuted under our state criminal justice system. And that's something that we really had to give pause and ask ourselves why. Why is it that we have new, wonderful legislation, but we don't see the prosecutions? And it gets particularly worse when you realize that this modern day slavery includes people selling minor children for sex. It is almost unconceivable to all of us, and any decent human being, that that is even possible in this day and age, or in any day and age. But it is a horrific reality here in New Hampshire. Not just in the world, not just in the country, but here in New Hampshire. We can wish it's not occurring in New Hampshire. We could pretend it's just an urban problem, but it's not. And to make matters worse, as we've all saying, it's a hidden crime. It is a crime that is rarely reported to law enforcement. Rather, it's a crime that law enforcement has to seek out and find. To give you an example of things that law enforcement can do, there's a phrase called beyond the traffic ticket. And that's a phrase used by law enforcement to say, look what's happening every time you meet somebody. In Littleton, New Hampshire, one of my North Country beautiful towns, a young woman provided incorrect information to 2 vigilant officers when they responded to a domestic disturbance. Instead of just letting that go and saying, oh, it's just somebody providing incorrect information, they asked themselves why. Flags began to go up. One of the officers had actually reviewed bulletins of runaways and thought, God, does this person look familiar to me? I'm not sure. Instead of letting it go, they proceeded on their gut instinct. That gut instinct that everybody in society needs to have when those flags go up to say something is just not right. And those officers did that. They looked into it more, they talked to her more, and found out that she was a 15-year-old runaway from Massachusetts, now in the North Country of Grafton County, in the beautiful town of Littleton, to engage in sex. It is happening everywhere. It's not just a Manchester Nashua problem and a Portsmouth problem, it's a New Hampshire problem. The reality is we need to see more offenders held accountable. In the Littleton case, there was a very successful prosecution and the offender was held accountable. We need to see that happen more. That's why the Enforcement Committee was designed at the guidance of the Attorney General. And we've, first of all, put together a group of experts around the state and a group of stakeholders around the state. And there are too many to mention. All corners of the federal government, the state government, advocates, and so forth. We're going to be analyzing the barriers to reporting these crimes, and already are. We're going to be educating law enforcement and other stakeholders about how to detect the subtle signs in trafficking and the more blatant signs, and provide guidance about how these cases should be investigated and prosecuted. First, we're organizing training opportunities for law enforcement throughout New Hampshire, and different levels of training opportunities. We're going to be looking at training opportunities for the first responders about how to identify the subtle signs, more advanced training for the detectives who actually start to investigate these crimes, including the technology you need to take advantage of in order to investigate these crimes effectively. Secondly, we're identifying the expertise we already have here in the state of New Hampshire. And that's one of the beauties of the state of New Hampshire, is that we share expertise and we share our knowledge, and we do that statewide. I can't emphasize enough how much we appreciate all these individuals, these passionate individuals who care so much to see human trafficking end, and their willingness and desire to share their expertise throughout the state. It's what's going to make us an effective state in combating this. Third, we're working with the Attorney General's office to develop protocols for the investigation and prosecution of human trafficking. These protocols will give clear-cut guidance about the necessary steps that must be taken to identify, investigate, and prosecute these cases. And again, we'll be there for each other. This is a multidisciplinary approach where we work with advocates and other stakeholders to hold the offenders accountable, but also put the needs of victims of these horrific crimes front and center. To all those who wonder, is this really happening in New Hampshire? I can't emphasize enough that it is. And the more you look for it, the more you see it. However, with a comprehensive plan for identifying these cases, as well as investigating them and prosecuting them, we can hope to hold offenders accountable and make New Hampshire a very unfriendly place for anybody who would think to be engaged in this despicable business of human trafficking. Thank you.
Thank you.